Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Ashvin Sood, and I am the GAP Fellow who works on the GAP Media Committee.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Magoon. I'm a GAP Fellow in the Humanities Committee.
And we, with the collaboration of our other GAP Fellows, are here today to present an overview of psychedelics and psychiatry. Today's presentation will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer service. Also, I do apologize about not being there today with you, but you're in good hands with Dr. Magoon. I'd like to acknowledge our GAP Fellows that helped create this presentation today. Those include Janet Beck, Natalie Feldman, Sam Jackson, Christopher Magoon, Hunter Neely, Dustin Nowoski, Monica Pietrek, Isabel Rosenthal, Ritwij Satodia, myself, Lisa Wagner, and Kelsey Wong, who will be moderating. Our objective today are to kind of review the history of psychedelics and their cultural and medicinal uses. We also want to identify psychedelics that are currently being researched, their pharmacological properties, and recent clinical trial data. And we also want to discuss the limitations behind the clinical trials, as well as the controversies that have developed during the period of renewed interest in psychedelics. So, what are some associations that come up with psychedelics? And I like to give everybody just a 5-second 10 pause to just kind of think about this for a second. So now that some of you kind of have your first inclination, we as fellows have heard throughout the year in preparation at different conferences what psychedelics were associated with and what psychiatrists thought about, you know. And the first, I think, big one is Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. These were psychologists, early advocates for psychedelics, and they were neuronauts, as some used to call them. Then we start thinking about Kessie's acid tests organized by the Merry Pranksters and popularized in Tom Wolfe's books, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Others asked if there would be free samples at our plenary, which I'm not sure, but you can ask Chris about. And a few have referred to Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, a big memoir of Michael Pollan, this famous author who tried all different types of psychedelics. And then a few mentioned more seriously that they have been doing some work and have been checking out some work at recent conferences, particularly the APA. And this year, there has been some types of sub-themes which were highlighted in the work being done on psychedelics. And here are some of the several titles that were presented in New Orleans recently. So I think what's important is that, we talk about a lot of the data, which we'll get to later, but we also want to know the ultimate purpose of all this work. And when we think about treating people with mental illness, I think it's important, and us as GAP fellows also thought about this as importance, that we need to view a patient's perspective when we examine how psychedelics affect them. So here, take a quick look into this video relating to the first Canadian to receive legal psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy.
The fear of the unknown is one aspect of the whole
Sorry about that.
less troublesome for me than not being there when I'm needed. Because the cancer is already spread into the intestines and my lymph nodes and peritoneal tissues, you're automatically stage 4. All they can offer you is palliative care. In the course of looking up research on mushrooms and cancer, you come across the Johns Hopkins studies. So I looked into that a little bit more, and they were talking about people who had, stage 4 cancer, just like me, and they were looking at cure rates of 80%. So people, the exact same problems that I have, 80%. We're coming out of this with a spiritually meaningful solution to their anxiety and depression. How could I possibly ignore 80%? How could anybody ignore 80%? And in my investigations, I came across Therasil. Very experienced and knowledgeable people who were able to tell me a lot of the things that I had no idea about psilocybin. I knew it was psychedelic, and I knew that it was something that, I'd learned my whole life was this evil thing. And then you find out that it can actually help people who have addictions problems. It can help people who have anxiety and depression, and they've been testing it, with all kinds of traumatic things like that. We make the application to the health minister, and you get an automatic reply back just to let you know they received it, and then the wait starts. I'll be putting on a blindfold to block out distractions, and some headphones with some music while we wait for the onset of that. What happens after that, I have no idea. I'm nervous, but I'm still looking forward to it very much. I can feel it's like if you're wearing a belt that's too tight and you loosen it up after a big meal.
Yeah.
It's more of a release than it wouldn't be fair to say that I'm a different person, because that's not the case. I'm still me, but some of my perspectives have changed as to what is out there, with a very strong sense that this is not all there is. I don't want to put any particular religious connotations on any part of this, because no clouds with angels and stuff like that, but most certainly a continuity of consciousness to other. I have to tell you, for the moment, the feelings of anxiety are really just not there. I know the cancer's still there.
Yeah.
But doesn't feel as helpless.
What's changed so that it doesn't feel as helpless?
Whether I am, fully successful in my treatment of my cancer, I know that there isn't necessarily things that I can do about it, but it doesn't feel like as much of a helpless, hopeless thing. Having cancer feels like being dragged behind a horse. It's out of your control. Maybe this would be a little closer to riding the horse, as opposed to being dragged by it.
What an image.
We're still on the horse. We're still going places, but it's not as out of control. If other people could get even a portion of the feeling of release that I have found, would strongly encourage them to do it.
There has to be a little ad at the end of these videos, but I think it just kind of highlights that people have had incredible experiences with psychedelics. And we will talk about psilocybin in a little bit. But let's first talk about the history, the roots of psychedelics. Psychedelics historically, have been used for spiritual and medicinal purposes. Religious practices in Africa, South America, North America, Central America, indigenous cultures with varying rituals, practices, and beliefs have all used psychedelics at one point or the other. If we look at these pictures from the left, you can see these pteroglyphs. They're from the Upper Yangtze Basin region in Mongolia. And this is a mushroom human pteroglyph on rock art from cultures known to have shamans using mushrooms as entheogens. Entheogens are substances to alter the state of mind for religious or spiritual purposes. But if we move from Mongolia, in the middle, we can see the Stela marble fragment known as the exhalation of the flower. This is found in Thessaly, Greece from 5th century BC, showing Demeter and Persephone with plants / possibly entheogens as well. And then here's a mushroom-shaped stone from Chukosito, I totally butchered that name, Peru, where there are also representations of mushrooms in the historical ceramic artifacts. And when we think about history, right, in the passage of psychedelics, there is also an aspect of colonialism to this. In Western colonialism, there was led to a loss of spiritual and botanical knowledge. There's a suppression of indigenous cultural practices during colonization, destruction of natural habitats of botanical medicines, and the roots of today's studies in psychedelics are tied to Western clinician and scientific appropriation of indigenous practice in North, Central, and South America. There have been case studies that have looked at this. One in particular is peyote. There are many indigenous spiritual practices in Mexico where individuals were severely persecuted and banned during the Spanish Inquisition, and hundreds of thousands of natives were brutally murdered. Unsurprisingly, surviving practices had to adapt / change to the oppressive cultural environment. And peyote, which was consumed in sacred rituals of the Huichols and the Tarahumaras of Mexico, then was adopted by a Native American church, which was formed in Oklahoma, and teaches a combination of Christianity and traditional Native American beliefs. So from left to right, you can see the peyote plant on the left, and then on the right, you see pilgrims who stop to pray in Huiracuta, which is a desert in central Mexico, sacred to the Huichol Native Americans. So there are pioneers in psychedelic research, and the modern era of research and potential clinical development of psychedelic drugs for treating a wide range of psychiatric disorders, including anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, wartime stress reactions, alcoholism, and other substance use disorders, was launched by the discovery of one molecule, which is LSD. It sparked a flurry of scientific research and potential medicinal applications of psychedelics during the 1950s and the 1960s. Now, LSD was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938 at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel, Switzerland, as a potential medicine. He later discovered its psychoactive effects in 1943 when exposed to a small dose of the substance. Now, between 1950 and the mid-1960s, there were more than 1,000 clinical papers discussing 40,000 patients, several dozen books, and 6 international conferences on psychedelic-assisted drug therapy. Many of these early studies were not particularly robust, and they lacked control groups. For example, they were likely patients were likely suffering from what researchers call publication bias. There was negative data that was excluded from final analyses, and that early findings were very overwhelmingly positive. And so the promise of LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and other psychedelic substances as tools in psychiatric investigation and the potential for medicinal application coincided simultaneously with the rapid advancement of research on medicines to treat anxiety, depression, and psychosis during the 50s. And these medicines were essential in the development of psychopharmacology, neuropharmacology, and the research funding came by way of pharmaceutical companies, institutions such as the NIH, the NIMH, and importantly through controversy from sometimes military and intelligence agencies. And by the 1960s, the popular and countercultural movements increasingly embraced psychedelic drugs for recreational use, leading to political backlash against psychedelics and triggering the war on drugs. By the end of the decade, this resulted in the vast majority of psychedelic drug research being halted. So when we talk about the fall of psychedelics, we think about political factors. In 1963, LSD began to appear as sugar cubes soaked in liquid and became popular as a recreational substance. It was increasingly associated with countercultural movements in the 1960s, including student riots and anti-war demonstrations, and it became a target of conservative factions in the US. LSD was made a controlled substance in 1966. And then the FDA additionally came apart, and in 1962, Congress passed a new drug safety regulation mandating that the drug needed to be proven safe and effective prior to approval. The FDA designated LSD as an experimental drug, which limited further research onto its effects. And according to some sources, no new clinical studies in psychedelics were done between 1976 and 1994. Now, the concerns were also raised about research being done in this area. The chair of Harvard's Social Relations Department voiced concerns that researchers in this area weren't looking at the data objectively, and that particularly those researchers who both studied and used substances like psilocybin were biased in their conclusions. So concerns were also raised about these biases and also about bad outcomes, with some reports of acute psychoses after taking hallucinogens. Advocates argued that more bad outcomes would have been seen in patients who didn't have access to these substances. And I think we all have to talk about, with the fall of psychedelics, we have to think about the conflict between Harvard and Timothy Leary. This conflict has become a prominent example of the conflicts over hallucinogens between the counterculture and the establishment during the 1960s. One of the most controversial figures of psychedelics, Timothy Leary, famously stated that drug research should be conducted with subjects rather than on subjects, and advocated for researchers taking psilocybin as well as the subjects too. And he and Richard Alpert, who we had seen earlier, started a group called the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, which organized a commune and encouraged undergraduates to join and seek out hallucinogens. Leary and Alpert gave psilocybin to seminary students to take in a chapel on Good Friday, leading to a significant amount of controversy. The ethics of how undergraduates were used in this research, as well as the concerns that study participants have formed a quote-unquote cult around Leary, led to he and Alpert's firing from Harvard. However, right now, there is a bit of a current psychedelic renaissance. So there was no clinical research with psychedelics from 1976 to 1994. And since the 1990s, there's been a renewed interest in the neurobiological potential and therapeutic potential of psychedelics drugs, including a quote-unquote second wave of psychedelic research in psychiatry. Currently, the application of therapeutic psychedelics has mainly been targeted toward mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety, and the modern area of controlled research with psychedelics has seen the adoption of more careful experimental designs, together with a more critical approach to outcomes. And as a result of positive outcomes in many recent clinical studies, there has been increasing support to decriminalize psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, at municipal and state levels. For example, in May 2019, Denver, Colorado became the first city in the US to decriminalize psilocybin following an initiative that collected enough signatures to put a measure on the ballot for municipal elections. Subsequently, Oakland and Santa Cruz also passed measures to decriminalize psychedelic substances. In November 2020, Oregon became the first state to legalize psilocybin for the use in therapy. And currently, in Washington, New York, Colorado, and California, they're all considering some form of psychedelic legalization, while several other states are enacting decriminalization, and yet others are researching potential medicinal benefits of psychedelics. So, psychedelics in general, right? We've talked about the history of them. We've talked about kind of the countercultural, the revolution of them, the downfall, and now the resurgent. But which ones are we talking about in particular, and how do they work? So let's turn our attention to psilocybin as our first psychedelic we'll talk about. The history of psilocybin begins in the Mexican town of Hualta de Jimenez in the Oaxaca state of Mexico. And here, as you can see on the left, Maria Sabine, she was often known as the matriarch of the magic mushroom. And she led the veladas, or nighttime purification rituals, for her family through the ingestion of these mushrooms. During this time, an investment banker turned amateur mycologist, Robert Wasson, became fascinated with these rituals. And after repeated attempts to gain entry to participating in the veladas, Wasson was ultimately allowed and then published his journey in life, garnering attention from the rest of the world. And as we had discussed him earlier, Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who was working with LSD, he became acquainted with Wasson and learned of his experiences and was given samples of psilocybin. This led to the development of the first pill of psilocybin. So, psilocybin, right? Let's look at the mechanism of action. So, psychedelic psychoactive compounds stem from multiple different species of mushroom. And these species include Gymnophilus, Inocybe, Pluteus, and Psilocybe, and many others. And in these mushrooms, there is a quantity of psilocybin, and in that quantity of metabolite, also known as psilocin. And now, psilocybin is the chemical compound we find in the caps and stems of the mushroom. And the reason why we bring up psilocin is because this is the primary active metabolite that leads to the psychomimetic properties. So when people say they are using psilocybin, they're actually getting the active ingredient psilocin to have that kind of effect. And how do we get to psilocin? Well, we need to understand the pharmacokinetics of drug absorption. Now, psilocybin is considered a pro-drug, right? And after ingestion, psilocybin is rapidly dephosphorylated in the gastrointestinal tract by alkaline phosphatase, leading to the molecule psilocin. Other metabolites, such as psilocin O-glucocornide or 4-hydroxyindole acetaldehyde, are renally excreted. And then psilocin passes into the bloodstream through the blood-brain barrier due to its non-polarizing state, and then primarily binds to the serotonergic receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, as an agonist. And as mentioned before, psilocybin and psilocin is renally excreted with a half-life of roughly 50 minutes. And it takes 24 hours for the compound to become undetectable in the urine. So let's all remember or attempt to remember cellular biology back from undergrad. And I will appreciate a good diagram when I see one. So when psilocin binds to 5-HT2A, and don't get too overwhelmed, but just kind of get an idea that there is a cascade of reactions. And this primarily goes through the G protein alpha Q subunit. Now, not to get too complicated, but at the end goal releases intracellular calcium, which leads to a depolarization of the cell. And if we go a bit bigger, we see psilocybin's effect on the default mode network. Briefly, the DMN is a network of interconnected pathways in our brain where we develop our sense of self or ego, and that gets activated when we're not focusing on anything in particular. So it's also a network where we often form thought patterns that become fixed. So if we think about medications like psilocybin, that dampens the DMN or the default mode network, allowing portions of brain that have not been activated for some time to wake up, allowing for psychological flexibility and the reduction in ruminative thought processes. Now, what are the physical manifestations of ingesting psilocybin or psilocin? What does that look like? Well, in healthy volunteers, changes in the emotion, consciousness, perception, and thought began about 20 to 30 minutes of ingestion and peaks about 30 to 50 minutes. And the peak effect persists for about 2 hours, with the resolution of the effect occurring within 6 hours. Lower doses may produce shorter lasting effects, and moderate doses may alter consciousness, increase introspection, induce derealization, dreamlike states, illusions, complex hallucinations, synesthesia, and altered perceptions of time and space. Muscle relaxation is also experienced with intoxication. We do see disruptions in attention, such as difficulty in disengaging from prior stimuli and impairment in monitoring several simultaneous visual stimuli, which have been described. There's also euphoria, grandiosity, other amplifications of the affective experience. The majority of psilocybin users experience a pleasure alteration mood, but some do experience panic or dysphoria. A user's expectations and environment very strongly influence the hallucinogenic effects. And settings with more interpersonal support reduce panic and paranoia and increase the positive experience. So if we were to look at what are the studies that have been done, famously in 1962, the Harvard Psilocybin Project conducted the Good Friday experiment. This was a randomized controlled trial with a sample size of 20 subjects that were divinity school students, and there were two groups, psilocybin and placebo, and the placebo is niacin. The study confirmed the entheogenic properties of psilocybin. Around the same time, between 1961 and 63, the Harvard Psilocybin Project was also conducting the Concord Prison experiment. This was an open label study which included 320 prison inmates as subjects. Results of the study showed that the recidivism rate of the experiment group was lower than that of the general prison population, but not significantly so. And shortly after these studies, Congress passed the Controlled Substance Act, which we had talked about earlier, which Nixon signed into law in 1970. And this classified psilocybin as a Schedule I drug, and unsurprisingly, psychedelic research declined. Recently, a notable study that, and this is more of recent clinical studies, investigated the effects of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy in subjects with MDD, or major depressive disorder. This was a randomized controlled trial with a waitlist control of a sample size of 27. The intervention included 2 psilocybin sessions. Session 1 received a dose of 20 milligrams per 70 kilograms. In session 2, there was a dose of 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms, with supportive psychotherapy of roughly around 11 hours given. Participants received a total of 18 in-person visits, including a preparatory and a follow-up meeting, and a 2-hour 8-hour sessions of psilocybin administration with 2 facilitators of varying education levels. And results from the study were promising, as the immediate treatment group had statistically significant improvements in the Grid-Hamilton Depression Rating Scale compared to the delayed treatment in similar points. And similar limitations in this small sample size included in the small sample size, showed that majority white non-Hispanic participants in short-term follow-up on the study, meaning that there were limitations here. And I apologize, majority were white non-Hispanic participants, and there was a short-term follow-up. Of note, adverse effects reported during the sessions included headache in about 33% of the sessions, elevated blood pressure greater than 170 over 100 in 2% of the sessions, and an elevated heart rate of 110 in 8% of the sessions. So not necessarily a significant side effect profile, but I think it does go to show that there are a lot of good data that's coming out on psilocybin. And now I'd like to transition to Chris, who will take over.
Now we'll move to talk about MDMA. So MDMA has multiple receptors and neurotransmitters which account for its effects. MDMA mainly acts as a releaser of serotonin and noradrenaline, and to a lesser extent, dopamine. Activity at the 5-HT1A and 1B receptors attenuates feelings of depression and anxiety, reduces the amygdala fear response, and increases levels of self-confidence. Increased feelings of closeness, greater compassion, and increased empathy further contribute to positive mood. MDMA also acts at alpha-2 receptors, which contribute to the drug's effects on thermoregulation and may also contribute to relaxation. MDMA has been shown to facilitate release of oxytocin, which can promote empathy and closeness. Additionally, MDMA has been demonstrated to increase levels of BDNF in the amygdala, which may allow for safe recall of painful emotional memories. Overall, MDMA promotes increased prosocial feelings, improved tolerance for unpleasant memories, and enhanced empathy, which can promote a strong therapeutic alliance to effectively process traumatic memories. Now, moving to clinical trials in MDMA. The use of MDMA in mental health has a long history and became widespread in the 1960s. Its use continued into the 1980s, especially in assisting with the treatment of trauma-related and anxiety disorders. Recreational use then gained popularity, which is when the rebranding to ecstasy occurred. As recreational use grew, clinical use slowed when MDMA became a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substance Use Act. Still, subsequent trials, primarily for the use in PTSD, tended to show positive benefits. Recently, the use of MDMA has been extended to other diagnoses as well. The first modern randomized controlled clinical trial demonstrating MDMA-assisted psychotherapy was published in 2010 and showed impressive results. 20 patients with treatment-resistant PTSD received, during the course of non-drug psychotherapy, either placebo or 2 or 3 sessions of MDMA. At 2-month follow-up, 83% of the patients in the MDMA group no longer met criteria for PTSD, compared with 25% of patients in the placebo group. There were no drug-related serious adverse events and no adverse neurocognitive effects. Of the 8 patients in the placebo arm, 7 enrolled in the crossover trial with a 100% clinical response rate. Long-term follow-up of the cohort of successfully treated patients demonstrated that the remission from PTSD was maintained for up to 6 years with a mean of 45 months without having any further doses of MDMA. So the effect seems pretty durable. The majority had many continued benefits from MDMA, including symptomatic relief, with no changes in the number of psychiatric medications, no new substance use, and no changes in cognitive function. There were many benefits endorsed by the 19 follow-up participants, including increased general well-being and self-awareness, as well as less excessive vigilance, avoidance, and nightmares. While the majority of participants reported benefits, including improved relationships and well-being, as well as decreased substance use, a minority reported harms. These harms primarily consisted of worsening mood. Of note, no participants reported any of these harms as being severe, and all participants who reported harm also at least reported one benefit. The first large phase 3 study in MDMA for PTSD in North America was recently published in 2021. This was a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover trial with 90 participants. Authors concluded that MDMA-assisted therapy is highly efficacious in individuals with severe PTSD, and treatment is safe and well-tolerated, even in those with comorbidities. As shown here, MDMA significantly attenuated PTSD symptomatology, as shown by the change in the CAPS-5, which stands for Clinician-Administered PTSD Scale for the DSM-5. That total severity score went from a baseline to 18 weeks after baseline. MDMA also significantly reduced depressive symptoms using the Beck Depression Inventory, as well as clinician-related functional impairment using the Sheehan Disability Scale. As shown here, MDMA also led to significant treatment responses, including 67% of participants in the MDMA group no longer meeting criteria for PTSD after treatment, compared with just 32% in the placebo group after 3 sessions. Additionally, 33% in the MDMA group, compared with only 5% in the placebo group, met criteria for remission after 3 sessions. Others have begun comparing the efficacy of MDMA to antidepressants. This is also in PTSD. Currently, there's only 2 medications that are FDA approved for PTSD, paroxetine and sertraline. As shown here, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy constitutes a substantial improvement over available pharmacotherapies in terms of safety and efficacy. Studies of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy had lower dropout rates compared to sertraline and paroxetine trials. As MDMA only administered under direct observation during a limited number of sessions, there's little chance of diversion, accidental or incidental overdose, or withdrawal symptoms upon discontinuation. Next, we're going to move on from MDMA to ketamine. Ketamine is a non-barbiturate dissociative anesthetic. It's metabolized by the liver, and it has approximately a 45-minute half-life. Mechanism of action is not fully understood, but the basic understanding is that it's thought to increase glutamate levels, and this is thought to potentiate synaptogenesis. There's also a thought that some of the effect might be mediated by BDNF as well. Also of note here, typical antidepressant dosage is actually below anesthetic doses. Getting into the history a little bit, ketamine was originally approved for anesthesia by the FDA in 1970. Ketamine is not formally approved by the FDA as a treatment for any psychiatric disorder, but intranasal S-ketamine was approved by the FDA in 2019 for treatment-resistant depression, with a unique specifier to include suicidality in adults. Because ketamine's already FDA approved and available in the market for off-label use, it's also been more readily available for researchers to study it. This study is just one example of an RCT of ketamine from 2013. Here, 73 patients were randomized to receive ketamine versus midazolam for treatment-resistant depression. The ketamine group had a significant improvement in depressive symptoms at 25 hours and a response rate that outperformed midazolam. Additionally, 2021 systematic review and meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Psychiatry provided support for the robust, rapid, and transient antidepressant effects and anti-suicidal effects from ketamine. with a large pooled effect size of 0.9 compared with placebo. Several international task forces, including the Canadian Network for Mood and Anxiety Treatments, have reviewed the efficacy and safety data for ketamine and provided recommendations for its use in various clinical practices for adults. Clinical trials have also been done for a variety of other disorders, including OCD, bipolar disorder, PTSD, various substance use disorders. The data are a little mixed here. A 2021 systematic review of the treatments of mental health treatments for ketamine reinforced this idea that there's a robust antidepressant and anti-suicidal effect, but showed that for other indications, the data are less robust for its efficacy. It also did warn that even the antidepressant and anti-suicidal effects, as well as for other indications, these studies all, per their analysis, have a high risk of bias and warrant further study. So we've talked about the history. We've talked about a few examples of different medications that could be used. And so, having shown some of the evidence of promise of these medications, let's dive into some of the controversies. While the studies may show that we have some of the most effective drugs that could be on the verge of use, if our patients don't actually get access to them, or there are widespread socioeconomic, racial, gender differences in access, then ultimately they're not going to be all that effective, or they'll just further exacerbate mental health disparities that already exist. The fact that these are Schedule I controlled substances impacts access to these drugs. So Schedule I, as you may already know, means that there's no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Other Schedule I drugs include heroin. Schedule II drugs include cocaine and fentanyl. This classification as Schedule I drug significantly limits policy recommendations, funding, and research, as you might imagine. Due to this classification, there's been very little federal funding for research. I think it's worth briefly explaining the mechanism of how this works exactly in terms of blocking federal funding. So there's a federal appropriations rider, a provision inserted into a funding bill that really affects what you can and can't spend federal funds on. This rider was first enacted in 1996, and it's been renewed every year since. The rider what it does is it prohibits federal funds from supporting, this is a quote, any activity that promotes the legalization of any drug or other substance included in Schedule I. That's why this Schedule I designation is so important. The rider then prohibits the use of federal funds to support research in psychedelics because they're Schedule I drugs. So they remain in Schedule I. You can see how this is sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. You can't study it to prove that it might have medical use, and so it stays Schedule I. So who is, if it's not the federal government funding this research, who is? It ends up being private companies that have their own, not only their own methodology, but also their own incentives as well. The FDA oversees them. They're currently overseeing they're overseeing multiple phase 3 trials for MDMA, as well as phase 2 trials for psilocybin. But again, these are funded by private parties, which raise equity concerns. And it goes maybe then to conclude this idea that if we were to infuse federal funds, we could help make psychedelics more equitable and inclusive, because it'd be less tied in with these private companies. Addressing this, there's a few ways you could do this. You could address this schedule classification. 1, you could just reschedule the drugs. 2, you could eliminate the rider. Or 3, and this is sort of an interesting way, you can create what's known as a technically distinct drug. So in terms of rescheduling, this would be done by an act of Congress. They could amend the Controlled Substance Act. The president or the attorney general could also command the DEA to reschedule the substance, or any person within or outside the government can petition the DEA, which may trigger the FDA to review the available evidence and then come up with a rescheduling. Bills to eliminate the rider that I just discussed have been proposed in 2019 and 2021. Both failed. However, last year, the National Institute on Drug Abuse funded a trial to investigate the use of psilocybin for smoking cessation, possibly reflecting an encouraging policy shift. So they were able to fund a study despite this rider. Moreover, and this is where this creating a technically distinct drug comes, there's a historical precedent for sidestepping Schedule 1 by using a specific formulation that is rescheduled as a technically distinct drug. Examples of this are dronabinol for AIDS-related anorexia in 1985, Xyrem was approved for the treatment of cataplexy with narcolepsy in 2004, extracts of cannabis are being used for childhood epilepsy. And then if you have this specific technically distinct formulation, you then just go through standard drug development. And once you get the license for it, you can use it like any other drug. There's also a controversy around patents for these medications. Once a specific formulation of a psychedelic has gained approval, companies can and are seeking patents for these formulations. A few access issues come into play then when these patents are there. Patenting psychedelics does exploit a traditional knowledge that was founded by indigenous communities, and the patent doesn't necessarily acknowledge or compensate those communities for taking that knowledge. Patents can also be used offensively, where patent holding companies may sue other nonprofits or smaller startups trying to study or produce the drug, essentially stifling research and access. Finally, there's this issue of licensing. How do psychedelic providers get licensed? The prescription model would require licensed prescribers, typically physicians, PAs, and Ps, to prescribe the medication. Some have envisioned an additional training, like, for example, buprenorphine, the waiver. Others have argued that this unnecessarily limits access. In Oregon, for example, trained facilitators who are not otherwise prescribers can be licensed by the Oregon Health Authority to administer psilocybin. Clients seeking psilocybin will not need a medical diagnosis. The facilitators will be a new type of professional trained in Western scientific knowledges, as well as indigenous uses of these plant medicines. The Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, appointed by Governor Kate Brown in March of 2021, is advising the Oregon Health Authority for rules in this emerging industry. I actually just checked the updated guidelines today, and I saw that currently all you need is a high school degree to be able to be eligible for being a facilitator of psilocybin in this case. Another controversy is safety. Because off-label protocols and dosing will vary, this will complicate attempts to assess the efficacy of MDMA and psilocybin for non-approved indications. Experts advocate that policymakers fund the development of registries to track outcomes, adverse events, patient complaints, and feedback about psychedelics, as well as trials of off-label or alternative clinics. It will be critical to establish structures to adhere to the Hippocratic Oath that we collectively, above all, do no harm. Psychedelics are powerful amplifiers of consciousness. An enhanced sense of connection to others not only underpins some of the therapeutic effects, but also results in enhanced vulnerability for the patient. When taken without adequate preparation, when surroundings are anxiety-provoking, for example, the psychedelic experience can cause fear, a prolonged sense of dread, or even full panic. Conversely, in controlled settings with warm surroundings, such adverse reactions are actually quite rare. The importance of this mindset, the importance of the mindset of the participant and the physical surroundings has been dubbed into the set and setting idea with psychedelic use, which you may have heard before. It's commonly referred to. Another controversy is that they're not really, we're sort of presenting it as a panacea, cure for all ills. And of course, it's not going to be that. The devil's going to be in the details. It's being written about almost daily in the popular press as a treatment with almost unlimited potential, but there are going to be limitations, and they carry a lot of negative connotations in some communities, but in other communities, the psychedelics are being seen as having less negative effects, as even really long-standing, well-tested pharmaceutical interventions for various psychiatric disorders. So it'll be important for psychiatrists in particular to teach their patients that psychedelic therapy expands rather than supplants the arsenal of evidence-based practices in psychiatry. Finally, the private sector has poured a lot of money into psychedelic treatments, which can cause misaligned incentives as they serve shareholders instead of patients. In conclusion, after this talk, we hope you'll agree that psychedelic medications are not new in the field of medicine. Because research and trials are still ongoing, there will be a lot of forthcoming information about when and how they can be used safely in psychiatric clinical practice. And as with any treatment modality, it's important that patients are well informed about the risks and alternative treatments available to them, including with psychedelics. So that concludes our talk. We would really like to thank the GAP Fellowship Committee for giving us this opportunity, especially the sponsors for the GAP Fellowship positions, committees and members of GAP who have advised and met with other fellows over the course of this fellowship term. And of course, to Francis Bell, thank you so much. This is now a time for audience participation, and we welcome any thoughts or questions you have. Thank you so much.